morning it happened, Margaret Ashford stepped out of her black Bentley and looked at the sign above the door, Brooks Repair and Machining, and laughed. Not a loud laugh, a soft one. The kind that slides out between polished lips without apology. The kind meant to be heard by the people standing closest. Her entourage heard it. Her driver heard it. The two managers flanking her heard it and looked away, because that was the appropriate response when their CEO found something beneath her. She did not know that the man inside the one wiping his hands on a grease-darkened cloth behind a steel workbench held 7 patents that 3 of her production lines ran on every single day. She did not know that the quiet of his shop was not the quiet of small ambitions. It was the quiet of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. She had just made the most expensive mistake of her professional life, and she was still smiling when she walked through the door. If this story sounds like something you need to hear to the end, stay with it. Every detail was placed there for a reason. The shop existed at the edge of an industrial block in a mid-sized city that had been growing in all the wrong directions for 20 years. The building was narrow. The exterior paint had gone gray and peeling, and the hand-lettered sign above the entrance had rusted at the corners in a way that made it look older than it was. But inside the space was different. Every tool hung in its designated place on a pegboard wall outlined in faint marker, so nothing was ever returned to the wrong hook. The workbenches were clear except for the active job. The floor was swept each morning before the first customer arrived, even when no customers were expected. The order of the place said something about the man who maintained it, though very few visitors ever paused long enough to read that message. Elijah Brooks was 39 years old, a tall black man with steady hands and an unhurried way of moving, and he had been running this shop for just under 4 years since the lease on a larger space had ended, and he had decided quietly and without announcement that smaller was what he needed right now. He had a daughter named Naomi, who was 6, missing 1 front tooth, and fiercely loyal to a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit, who lived on the corner of Elijah's workbench during school hours. Each morning, he was up by 6 o'clock making breakfast, and then carefully parting Naomi's hair into 2 neat puffs with the red bows she had picked out herself the night before. He dropped her at the neighbor's house at 7:45 and picked her up at 5 o'clock. In between, he worked. What most people in the neighborhood did not know, because Elijah had never told them and the information was not on any visible surface, was that he had spent 11 years before the shop as a lead systems engineer at Maritex Engineering Group, one of the more respected industrial automation firms on the East Coast. He had designed production line control systems for manufacturers in 7 states. He had filed 7 patents during those years, all under his own name per his contract, all related to precision automation and cascade failure prevention in industrial machinery. 3 of those patents had been licensed to major manufacturers through Maritex's IP division, and the royalty payments deposited into his account. Each quarter were modest but reliable. Elijah had left Maritex not because the work dried up, not because he was pushed out, but because his wife, Simone, had died of a fast-moving illness when Naomi was 18 months old, and someone had to be home. He had made that choice with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. He did not grieve it publicly. There was a photograph of Simone on the shelf above the radio in the kitchen, her smile wide, her hand resting on a small Naomi, who could not yet stand on her own. Elijah looked at that photograph every morning while the coffee brewed. He did not speak about his former career unless directly asked, and almost no one directly asked. His friend Daniel Carver, who had known him since their first year of college and now ran a small investment fund across town, asked about it regularly. Elijah's answer was always the same deflection, a slight turn of the head, a return to whatever was in his hands. Daniel understood that the conversation would happen when Elijah was ready for it to happen, and not before. The one thing that kept Elijah's name alive in industrial circles without his name ever actually appearing was his reputation for fixing what others could not. Word moved slowly in that world from plant manager to plant manager, from maintenance supervisor to shift foreman. And the word was simple. If a machine stopped working and no one else could bring it back, call the man at Brooks Repair. He did not advertise. He did not have a website beyond a single page listing with a phone number. He charged fairly. He never failed to deliver. Each evening after Naomi was asleep and the house was quiet, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and whatever technical documentation he was working through, keeping his knowledge current in the same disciplined way he kept his tools organized. He had learned his earliest lessons about tools from his father, a machinist who had spent 32 years on the line at a factory across town, and who used to tell him, in a voice softened by long Sunday afternoons, that precision was a form of respect. Elijah was not waiting for anything, but he was ready. The call that changed the trajectory of everything came on a gray Tuesday morning in early October. It did not come to Elijah first. It came to a man named Bradley Sterling, the chief financial officer of Ashford Industrial, who received it from the plant manager of the company's second manufacturing facility at 6:52 in the morning. The message was direct and alarming. The primary CNC production line had gone down overnight. A cascade fault had propagated through the control board. The entire system was frozen, and the technical team on site had been unable to isolate the source for 3 hours. Ashford Industrial was a precision metal components manufacturer, the third largest in the northeastern United States by revenue. And the second facility was currently under contract to supply a defense subcontractor with a delivery deadline 48 hours away. Bradley Sterling called 2 national maintenance contractors before 8 in the morning and received the same answer from both. They could send a team in 72 hours. He called the original equipment manufacturer's service line and was placed on hold. He called Margaret Ashford's direct line at 8:20 and told her the situation with the careful verbal framing of a man who had long since learned how to present bad news in the least damaging shape possible. Margaret listened, said 4 words, "Fix it by noon," and ended the call. Bradley's fourth call was to the plant manager who had originally reported the failure, a veteran named Hank Morrison, who had been running that facility for 22 years, and who responded to Bradley's escalating frustration with a flat Midwestern calm. Hank said he knew one person who might be able to help. He said he couldn't guarantee it. He said the person in question ran a small shop and might not take the call. Bradley said to give him the number anyway. Hank gave it to him and added, before hanging up, that this particular person had once diagnosed a cascade fault in under 4 minutes that a certified systems team had spent 2 days misidentifying. Bradley Sterling wrote the number down skeptical and dialed it. Elijah answered on the 3rd ring. He was already at the workbench. The call lasted 4 minutes. Elijah asked which generation of control board, what the ambient temperature in the facility had been the previous night, and whether the fault codes were showing in sequence or simultaneously. Bradley answered all 3. Elijah was quiet for several seconds after the 3rd answer, the kind of silence that comes from rapid internal calculation rather than uncertainty. Then he said he would come. He asked for the address. He did not ask about the fee, and Bradley, flustered, forgot to mention it. Elijah hung up, set the phone face down on the bench, and began packing his secondary kit with the methodical efficiency of someone who already knew what he was walking into. He left biscuit on the workbench for Naomi. He left a note on the door. He drove his 11-year-old pickup truck across the city and arrived at Ashford's second facility at 9:40. The facility was large, clean, and surrounded by a fleet of leased vehicles that collectively cost more than Elijah's shop. A group of people were standing in the parking lot near the entrance when he pulled in. Margaret Ashford, among them, in a charcoal coat phone in one hand, the other hand raised to shade her eyes as she assessed the arriving truck. Elijah stepped out, a tall black man in dark work pants, a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his older boots. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder. He looked at the building first, then at the group. Margaret Ashford looked at him the way certain people look at things that arrive in an unexpected package, with a brief, visible recalibration that ends not in openness, but in revised condescension. Her assistant, Rachel Bennett, stood 2 steps behind her and said nothing. Elijah nodded in the direction of the general group. No one nodded back. He followed Hank Morrison inside. What happened in the next 2 hours and 20 minutes was witnessed only by Hank and the 2 floor technicians who had been asked to remain nearby in case Elijah needed assistance. He did not need assistance. He worked through the control cabinet systematically. His movements unhurried, his focus absolute. He did not speak except once to ask for a specific diagnostic cable that Hank retrieved from a side cabinet. He did not consult documentation, which Hank found remarkable given that the system was a proprietary configuration from nearly a decade earlier. At 11:47, the production line restarted. The cascade fault had been a secondary ground loop failure, masking a corrupted initialization sequence, a problem that the original equipment manufacturer's remote diagnostics would likely have taken 2 additional days to correctly identify. Hank stood at the edge of the floor and watched the first components move through the line with the measured satisfaction of a man who had seen a great many things go wrong in this building and not nearly enough go right. Elijah packed his tools. He walked out of the facility and back into the main corridor, where Margaret was waiting with Bradley Sterling and 2 of the operations managers. She was already on her phone again. When Elijah appeared, she ended the call and said with the brisk efficiency of someone settling an invoice, how much Elijah gave her the number. It was a fair rate, not inflated, not discounted. Margaret didn't look up when she instructed Bradley to process the payment. Bradley looking at Elijah with the poorly concealed amusement of a man who considers himself to have successfully managed a minor inconvenience, said to the room in general that it was a good thing they had found someone. And wasn't it convenient that the small shop rate was so much easier on the quarterly budget than the contract firms? One of the managers smiled. Another looked at the floor. Bradley kept talking. Something about operational cost management. And the phrase small operation came out of his mouth twice in 30 seconds, each time with the same slight inflection that distinguished it from a neutral description and made it something else entirely. Margaret did not stop him. She was already scrolling through her phone. Rachel, standing behind Margaret, looked at the far wall with a careful blankness that Elijah recognized as the expression of someone who was embarrassed by what they were witnessing, but did not have the standing to interrupt it. Elijah did not respond to Bradley. He did not look at Margaret for a reaction. He zipped his bag closed in the same unhurried way he had opened it and settled the strap on his shoulder. Margaret looked up briefly and said with a finality that was almost gracious in its efficiency, "Thank you for coming on short notice. If we have smaller issues in the future, we'll be in touch." The word smaller landed in the room and sat there. Elijah looked at her directly for the first time that day, and there was nothing in his expression that she could use no offense, no anger, no plea for recognition. He looked at her the way a person looks at a system they are studying, noting its properties without judgment. He said it was no problem. Then he walked out. Hank Morrison caught up with him, near the exit, reached out and shook his hand with both of his own, and said quietly that the control system Elijah had just repaired was originally designed by a Maritex team about 9 years back. Said he had been there when it was installed, and he'd never seen anyone outside the original team work on it without documentation. He said he didn't know if Elijah knew the system from somewhere, but whatever the case, he was grateful. Elijah thanked him without elaborating. He walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, without starting the engine, looking through the windshield at the clean industrial facade of the building that bore the name Ashford on a brushed steel plate beside the entrance. His face was still. His hands were still. There is something worth pausing on here before we go any further. What happened in that corridor was not loud, and it was not dramatic. It was casual. And maybe that is the part that ought to sit a little heavier, because casual dismissal is the version most people never get called out for. The person delivering it has usually never imagined being on the receiving end of it. The people we underestimate most, in my experience, are the ones who carry themselves quietly. We mistake their stillness for absence. We mistake their patience for passivity. And we almost never find out what they were actually capable of until it is already too late to revise our first impression. Elijah Brooks was sitting in that truck running calculations that would within a few years redirect the entire arc of Margaret Ashford's company. And she had no idea because she had never thought to look. Then he reached into the center console and pulled out a manila folder he had not opened in more than 2 years. It contained a document from his Meritex period, a consulting report he had been commissioned to write on the rehabilitation potential of an older Ashford facility. He looked at the cover page for a moment. Then he put the folder back, started the truck, and drove to pick up Naomi. Daniel came over that evening with a six-pack and no particular agenda, which was his way of saying he knew something had happened, and he was available if Elijah wanted to talk. They sat at the kitchen table after Naomi was in bed, and Elijah laid out the day without editorializing the visit, the repair, the payment, the comments from Bradley Sterling. Daniel listened to all of it, and then asked the question he had been quietly forming since the first sentence. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah said he was thinking about the Brookhaven facility. Daniel set down his bottle. The Brookhaven facility was the third manufacturing plant in the Ashford portfolio, a property that Margaret Ashford had shuttered 14 months ago on grounds of operational inefficiency. It sat on 12 acres in a neighborhood called Brookhaven, about 6 miles from where they were sitting now. The machinery inside was old. The building itself was mid-century industrial, and the whole property had been carrying a for sale listing for 9 months with no takers because of its reputation as a money pit. Daniel knew all of this because Elijah had mentioned it once before, months ago, in a context that had not seemed important at the time. Now, hearing Elijah say the name again in that tone, Daniel understood that it had been important all along. What Daniel did not know in that moment, what Elijah told him over the next hour, was the full shape of what existed inside Brookhaven, and why the conventional wisdom about it was wrong. Elijah had been inside that facility 5 years earlier, during his consulting period, when Ashford's previous management had commissioned a rehabilitation study before Margaret took the helm. He had spent 3 days there with a small technical team, and he had written a detailed report concluding that 70% of the installed equipment was recoverable with targeted investment, and that the production capacity, if properly upgraded, would outperform either of Ashford's active facilities at a significantly lower per-unit cost. That report had been received, and as Elijah had later learned, forwarded by Margaret to Bradley Sterling to be handled. It had not been acted on. The facility had been closed. Instead, Elijah knew the report had gone into a drawer because he had followed up once professionally and received a form response. He had not followed up again, but he had not forgotten what he had seen inside that building, and he had not forgotten the specific equipment configurations, the infrastructure layout, or the particular capabilities that could be unlocked if someone who understood the underlying systems was willing to do the engineering work. Someone who had, as it happened, designed several of the control systems that would integrate with that equipment. Someone who held the patents. Daniel asked one question. He asked how long. Elijah said 18 months from acquisition to first production. Daniel sat with that for a moment. The way a person sits with a number they are checking against their internal confidence register. Then he said he was in. He did not ask about projected returns. He did not ask about risk. He asked when Elijah wanted to start the legal process. Elijah said tomorrow. If there is something gentle to take from this stretch of the story, it might be this. The way a person treats the man fixing their machine often tells you more about who they are than any rehearsed speech could. We learn the most about people, not when they are performing for an audience, but when they think no one important is watching. The small habit of treating every person who walks into a room with the same baseline of respect is one of the few habits in this world that compounds quietly over a lifetime and rarely costs the person who keeps it. It is also the habit Margaret Ashford was about to wish she had kept. The legal contact was a property attorney named Henry Whitaker, a careful man with an office that smelled of old books, who had handled Elijah's patent agreements during the Maritex years, and who received Elijah's call the following morning with measured surprise. Elijah asked about the current ownership status and listing terms for the Brookhaven property. Henry said he would look into it and call back by end of day. He called back in 4 hours. The asking price was lower than Elijah had expected, not dramatically lower, but low enough that the number felt like a door being held open. The property had been sitting long enough that Ashford's board had apparently authorized Bradley Sterling to accept any reasonable offer rather than continue carrying the asset on a balance sheet that was already drawing attention heading into the annual audit. Henry said there was no indication that the seller was scrutinizing buyers beyond standard financial qualification. Elijah said to draft the offer. He sat with the numbers that evening and ran them 3 times, not because he doubted his engineering estimate, but because discipline required it. The capital Daniel was committing covered acquisition initial rehabilitation and 14 months of operating runway before the first production revenue arrived. It was tight. It was not impossible. Elijah had worked with tighter tolerances than that for most of his career, and the principle was the same. Precision mattered more than margin, and patience mattered more than speed. He drove to Brookhaven on a Thursday afternoon, while Naomi was at school, arriving in a light rain that turned the old building's brick exterior a deep rust color. The facility had been locked and dark for more than a year, and the loading bay doors wore chains with padlocks, but Elijah had arranged temporary access through Henry's office. He walked through the entire floor space over the course of 4 hours, moving through each section with the slow attention of someone reading a language they knew fluently. He checked structural connections, examined motor housings, assessed conduit runs, tested manual overrides on the equipment where they existed. He did not take notes because he did not need to. Everything he needed was already organized in his memory, in the way that certain minds organize things they have decided to care about permanently. By the time he walked back out into the rain, he had revised his 18-month estimate down to 15. The building had aged well in the ways that mattered, and poorly in the ways that were correctable. The purchase closed on a quiet Friday morning. No press release, no announcement. The acquiring entity was Brooks Industrial LLC, a company that had been registered 3 weeks prior, with Daniel as co-owner and Elijah as managing director. The filing was public record available to anyone who searched for it. But no one who worked at Ashford Industrial had reason to search for it, and the name Brooks appearing in a routine commercial property transaction carried no flag. Bradley Sterling signed the transfer documentation during a meeting he had scheduled for 30 minutes, and which he spent largely reviewing his phone. The former Ashford employees who had been laid off when Brookhaven closed were not informed of the sale, though several of them would learn of it soon enough, through channels that did not require an announcement. In the weeks after the acquisition, Elijah worked quietly through the hiring process, reaching out through Hank Morrison's network and through former Maritex contacts to find people with the specific skills the Brookhaven operation would need. He did not post listings publicly. He called people directly, explained the project plainly, and offered a wage that was fair without being extraordinary. What drew people in was not the money, but the nature of the offer itself. A chance to work on something being built from the ground up by someone who knew exactly what he was building and why. Among the first 15 hires were 6 former Brookhaven employees who had been cut when Margaret closed the facility. They knew the building. They knew the equipment. They showed up on the first day of interior work with a focused energy that Elijah recognized and respected. There is something quietly worth noticing in how Elijah ran this. He did not hire the most credentialed people available. He did not chase the resumes that would have impressed an investor pitch. He called the people who had been thrown away by the previous regime the people who knew the building because they had walked its floors for years. That is a particular kind of judgment, and it tends to pay back at higher rates than the textbooks predict. People who have been dismissed once and then given a second chance tend to bring an intensity to the work that you cannot purchase any other way. Elijah understood this not from a management book, but from his own life. He had been dismissed too. He just had not told anyone about it. He did not give a speech. He showed them what they were going to build, answered their questions directly, and then they began. There was a particular satisfaction in watching those 6 people walk back through a door that had been closed on them, carrying tool bags and wearing the same work boots they had worn before the layoff, returning not with bitterness, but with the specific determination of workers who understood the value of what they were being given. Elijah registered that satisfaction and set it aside. There was too much work ahead for sentiment to occupy much space. While Elijah built Ashford Industrial, entered a period of compounding friction that its leadership was slow to accurately diagnose. A defense subcontract that had been expected to renew did not renew. The contracting agency citing concerns about delivery reliability in their evaluation notes. A second client reduced its order volume without formal explanation. Margaret received these signals through Bradley Sterling's reporting, which framed each setback as an isolated market fluctuation rather than a systemic pattern. The quality control issues that were generating the underlying client dissatisfaction had been accumulating across Ashford's active facilities for nearly 2 years, the result of deferred maintenance and staffing reductions that had followed Margaret's restructuring program. The program had improved short-term margins and damaged long-term capability, a trade-off that was common and that experienced operations people recognized immediately. Margaret was experienced in capital strategy and market positioning. She was less experienced in the floor-level mechanics of production quality, and the people around her who understood those mechanics had been filtered out through several rounds of performance review that rewarded financial fluency over operational knowledge. Rachel Bennett was one of the people who understood something was wrong before it appeared in the numbers. She had been Margaret's executive assistant for 4 years, a role that gave her access to correspondence meeting summaries and client communications that presented the full picture rather than the curated version that moved up the reporting chain. She had written a memo 9 months earlier, carefully worded outlining the pattern she was seeing in client feedback and maintenance request frequency. Margaret had read it, marked it, and forwarded it to Bradley with instructions to review. Rachel had not received a response and had not been invited to discuss it further. She had continued doing her job and watching. It was during this period of watching that she first noticed the Brooks Industrial name in a transaction summary she processed as part of the routine paperwork that crossed her desk. The name meant nothing to her in that moment. She logged it and moved on. The Brooks Industrial operation at Brookhaven reached what Elijah called first production, meaning the line was running clean at sustainable volume in the 14th month, after acquisition 1 month ahead of schedule. The initial product was a category of precision-machined aerospace component that fell within a specification range that very few North American manufacturers could reliably meet. Elijah had designed the production process to hit that specification consistently using a control system integration that reflected both his engineering background and the specific capabilities of the Brookhaven equipment, updated and modified by his own hand. The tolerance margin on the first production run was 15% tighter than the published industry standard. Daniel, who was present for the first full shift, said nothing for a long time after reviewing the quality report. Then he said that they were going to have more work than they could schedule within 6 months. Elijah said he knew. The first commercial contract came from a mid-tier defense subcontractor that had 14 months earlier been an Ashford Industrial client. They had left Ashford after the delivery failure and spent the intervening period working with a less capable supplier while quietly monitoring the market for something better. They received a brief technical summary about Brooks Industrial through a mutual contact in the industry, ordered a small evaluation batch, and received it on the scheduled date with documentation that exceeded their internal quality benchmarks. They sent a contract inquiry the following week. Elijah's legal team reviewed it, made 2 adjustments, and returned it signed. The relationship was not announced. In the world of precision manufacturing, the deals that mattered most were almost never announced. By the 16th month, Brooks Industrial had 3 active production contracts and a 4th under negotiation with a German automotive supplier that had been searching for a North American partner capable of meeting their exacting dimensional standards. The conversation with the German team had been initiated through an intermediary and conducted with the measured patience of 2 parties who both understood that the right agreement was worth waiting for. When the contract was finalized, the annual value was larger than Ashford Industrial's total revenue from the previous quarter. The news appeared in a trade publication briefly in a single paragraph that named Brooks Industrial and described it as an emerging precision components manufacturer based in Brookhaven. There was no photograph of Elijah Brooks. There was no background on the company's founding. There was only the name, the location, and the number. What is quietly worth noticing about this stretch of the story is the discipline of working without an audience. Most of us are taught sometimes, without realizing it, to chase visibility, to announce our progress, to make sure the right people see what we are building. Elijah did the opposite. He worked because the work was worth doing. And the small irony is that people who build that way often end up being seen anyway, just not on their own schedule, and rarely for the reasons they would have chosen. There is something steadying about that. The work done patiently and correctly has a way of finding its own light eventually. It does not need to be hurried into the room. Bradley Sterling read the paragraph at his desk and felt the temperature of the room change around him in a way that had nothing to do with the climate control system. He did a transaction search on Brooks Industrial LLC and found the property record for the Brookhaven acquisition. He sat with that for a long time. He ran the numbers on what Brookhaven's current production capacity was likely to be based on the known equipment configuration and the reasonable assumptions about what a competent operator could achieve with proper investment. The result sat in his chest like a stone. The price he had accepted for the property, the price he had been authorized to accept, yes, but had also advised, was reasonable, represented a fraction of what the asset was now generating. He closed the browser and did not open it again that day. He did not bring it to Margaret's attention. Rachel Bennett, working separately and more carefully, traced the same path and arrived at a different response. She searched the Brooks Industrial name in combination with the Brookhaven facility and the known transaction date. She found the public filing and Elijah Brooks's name as managing director. She sat with that for a moment, then typed his name into a separate search, adding the word Meritex. The results that came back were not surprising in the way unexpected information surprises. They were surprising in the way that something you should have known all along surprises. The lurch of recognition that arrives a beat too late. 7 patents, 11 years of systems engineering at a firm whose clients included, among many others, Ashford Industrial. She printed the relevant pages, collated them with the Brookhaven transaction record, and placed them in a folder on her desk. She sat looking at that folder for a while before she picked up her pen and wrote Elijah Brooks's name on the tab in her neat, unhurried hand. She did not go to Bradley. She understood with the clarity that comes from 4 years of watching what happened to information that went through Bradley before it reached Margaret, that this particular folder needed to travel a different route. She waited for the right moment to take it to Margaret directly. That moment came on a Thursday evening when the two of them were working late, as they often did at the end of the quarter. Margaret reviewing reports at the conference table. Rachel, handling correspondence nearby. Rachel placed the folder on the table beside Margaret's water glass without comment. Margaret looked at her, then down at the folder, then opened it. She read the first page slowly, then the second, then the patent list. She went back to the photograph on the first page, a professional headshot from a Maritex profile that was 6 years old, showing a man in a dark jacket looking directly into the camera with the composed, unguarded expression of someone who had nothing to perform. Margaret recognized the face. She recognized the posture. She recognized the exact quality of stillness. The man who had walked into her facility carrying a worn tool bag. The man whose work had restarted a production line she had been told could not be restarted. The man she had thanked for handling a small matter. She closed the folder and held very still for a moment. Then she asked Rachel how long ago the Brookhaven acquisition had closed. Rachel told her. Margaret did not say anything more that evening. The audit that followed was Margaret's decision made without announcement and framed to the board as a routine operational review. Rachel was assigned to support the audit team, which meant she had access to the full documentation trail around Bradley Sterling's management of the Brookhaven disposition process. The trail was not clean. The property valuation Bradley had accepted and recommended to the board had not been supported by an independent assessment. The risk flags in the due diligence file were sparse in a way that suggested they had not been fully completed. And there was a section of the file related to the buyer's background, where the verification field was blank. It was a procedural failure, compounded by a reporting failure, the second being worse than the first, because it had been ongoing and deliberate. The audit team presented their findings in a document that was thorough and, in its thoroughness, unambiguous. Bradley Sterling submitted his resignation 4 days before the findings were formally presented to the board. He submitted it quietly by email, with a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities. Margaret accepted it without response. She sat alone in the conference room after the last board member filed out. The window on the far wall looked west toward Brookhaven, though the building itself was not visible from this distance. She pulled the folder Rachel had given her out of her briefcase and set it on the table again. She had read it 3 more times since that Thursday evening, not because she was learning new information, but because she was doing something harder, which was revising the story she had told herself about the man whose shop she had laughed at, whose fee she had processed without looking up, whose capability she had summarized in the words "small" and not thought about again until a trade publication forced her to. She found Elijah Brooks's phone number through Henry Whitaker's office, which took 1 call and no particular difficulty, because Elijah had not hidden himself. He had simply never been asked. He answered on the 2nd ring. She said her name. There was a pause that was not awkward, only genuine. The pause of a person who was deciding how to respond rather than whether to respond. He said hello. She said she would like to meet and discuss a potential supply arrangement. He said he was available Tuesday morning. She asked where would work for him. He said the shop on Brook Street. She said she would be there at 9 o'clock. She arrived alone. No assistant, no driver, no documents under her arm. She had not been in the shop before. She had stood at the entrance that first day and not come in. Inside, she saw it differently than she would have seen it that day. The ordered tools, the clean benches, the framed photograph on the back wall, a group of engineers in front of a completed production facility, Elijah younger by a decade and standing second from the left. And on the corner of the main workbench, a small white stuffed rabbit with button eyes and one ear slightly more worn than the other. Beside it, propped against a coffee tin, was a small drawing in crayon on lined paper. 2 figures holding hands, a tall one and a short one with the words, "Me and Daddy," in careful and even letters. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. There was something disorienting about standing in this room after standing in her own offices for so long. Something about the scale and the material honesty of the space that made the language she normally relied on feel poorly fitted to the occasion. Elijah came through the back door with 2 mugs of coffee, set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and sat on the stool across the bench. She wrapped her hands around the mug and said what she had come to say. First, that she had reviewed his background and understood now who she had been working with, and that she wanted to discuss a long-term supply agreement for precision components. Elijah listened to the full shape of her proposal. Then he said that he appreciated her directness. Then he said one other thing, not sharply, not as an accusation, but as a plain statement. "Do you remember that afternoon at Facility 2? She looked at him. He said he didn't need anything from her about it. He said that what happened that day was what it was, and he hadn't lost sleep over it. But he wanted her to understand that the shop was real, and the work was real, and he had never been ashamed of either." She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not offer the easy apology that would have ended the moment quickly. She said she understood that now. It was not the same thing as an apology, and they both knew it. But it was something more specific than an apology, which was an honest acknowledgement made directly to the person it was owed to. She pushed a folder across the bench. He looked at the cover, did not open it. She said, "Take whatever time you need to review the terms." He said he would. She stood to go, picking up her coat from the second stool where she had draped it. At the door, she turned and looked at the sign above the entrance, the hand-lettered name that had rusted at the corners, and that she had laughed at once in a voice meant to be heard. She did not laugh now. She read it as information plain and accurate, the name of the man, and the place where he worked, neither more nor less than that. Daniel stopped by the shop that evening and found Elijah at the bench with the folder open, reading through the supply agreement terms with the deliberate care he brought to any document that carried consequences. Daniel set a coffee on the corner of the bench beside Biscuit and asked what he was looking at. Elijah said, "Ashford wants a supply arrangement." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Are you going to do it?" Elijah said he was thinking about it. Daniel said, 3 months ago that would have been a strange thing for you to say." Elijah turned the page and said, 3 months ago I wasn't ready to ask whether she was worth it. Now I am. That's different. Daniel picked up his coffee and said nothing more, which was his way of indicating that he understood the distinction completely. 3 weeks later, Elijah signed the agreement. Not because he needed the contract. Brooks Industrial had enough to sustain itself and grow on its own terms. He signed it because the terms were fair and the product would be used well, and because, as he told Henry Whitaker when they reviewed the final document together, good work ought to go where it can do the most. Henry had looked at him over his reading glasses and said that was an unusual reason for a business decision. Elijah said he had made unusual decisions before, and most of them had worked out. The shop sign came down on a Saturday morning. Elijah did it himself up on a ladder with a socket set, unbolting the old bracket from the fascia board, while Naomi stood below in her jacket, her hair in 2 careful puffs, with the red bows holding Biscuit and watching. When the old sign was off, she asked what the new one was going to say. Elijah climbed down and stood beside her, looking at the clean rectangle of exposed brick where the old sign had been. He said, "Just Brooks." Naomi thought about that and nodded with the grave consideration that 6-year-olds apply to decisions they have been included in. The new sign went up that afternoon, clean and flat and simple. 1 word in dark letters, no descriptor, no qualifier. The name had always been enough. It had just taken the world a while to read it correctly. In the kind of city where people move fast and judge by surface, the story of Elijah Brooks was not a story that would ever be told loudly. No profile, photograph, no origin narrative republished on the platforms where such stories were usually performed. The trade publications mentioned Brooks Industrial occasionally, when a contract was significant enough to note. The number of people who knew the full arc of what had happened could have fit in the front room of the shop. But in the world where precision and patience and the willingness to work without an audience determined what lasted. Elijah Brooks had built something that would still be running long after the names on the Ashford letterhead had changed several times over. He had done it without announcement and without revenge, because those were not the tools he worked with. He had done it the same way he fixed the machine that day, quietly, correctly, completely. And when the work was finished, he turned off the light and went home to his daughter. There was a quiet wisdom in what Elijah did at the end. He could have refused the contract. He could have made Margaret read about him in trade journals for the rest of her career and never sat across from her again. But he did not, because the energy required to nurse a grievance is the same energy that could go into raising a daughter or running a shop or finishing the work in front of you. And he had already chosen where his energy belonged. The most powerful thing he did, when you really look at it, was the simplest thing in the whole story. He went home. That is a kind of strength most stories never bother to celebrate, because it does not photograph well, and it does not fit easily into a headline. But it is the kind that lasts. And it is the kind that in the end is available to almost anyone willing to choose it.